All right, so I decided to do my annotated bibliography on Jack Kerouac's On the Road. Most of the scholarship views On the Road through lenses of social protest, jazz literature, and critical race theory, and new spirituality. So I've broken it into those three groups. Older commentary seems generally more negative and surface level because the movement had not really had time to pick up steam and legitimize itself. Whereas more recent commentary views the beat movement in context of the movements before and after it. So there's a lot more tracing literary references and themes through authors and works on both sides of the movement. There's more talking about, theorizing about the intentions of the people being discussed, not just how they strike the author, the critic, but actually what they were thinking, what they were trying to do. And then there's a lot more socio-critical lenses applied, which is probably just a result of critical theory blowing up in the 90s. And then it takes Eastern religious influences more seriously, whereas older scholarship is more dismissive of that. And then older scholarship insists that the Beats are idiots and nihilists, which you don't get much of that in the new scholarship. They might reference it in reference to older scholarship, but the Beats are viewed as legitimate artists by the middle of the 60s. And older scholarship views the movement as a rebellion based in anger and idleness, rather than some sort of positively grounded vision of the world that could actually contribute anything to a discussion. But with that said, we'll start with the sources that talk about social protest. I've got 5 of them. A few of the others may discuss it, but these 5 really nail it down. 2 from the late 50s, 1 from the early 60s, and then a couple from after the 90s and after. So the oldest source, Van der Haag from 1958, the article is titled Kerouac Was Here, and it was published in a publication called Social Problems, Volume 6, which I thought was laugh out loud funny that Kerouac is being viewed as a social problem. Like, this isn't a literature publication or some sort of specific cultural publication. This is a publication for anything that is a problem with society, apparently. But the article was written around the time of Kerouac's ascent, so like when critics would start writing about him, but not really when the public would be aware of him. It frames the Beat generation as rebellious teenagers who are bored with their comfy lives, and instead of disciplining themselves and discipling themselves, the author says, quote, they celebrate their normlessness, end quote. And he says that the Beats want to live in this no man's land between art and commerce. They don't want to be artists. They don't want to be salesmen. They just want to be unemployed wanderers that do a little bit of both. His main critique is that they are trying to find meaning in the simple act of rebelling, which I don't think is a fair critique at all, because it doesn't point at any of the actual things that the movement is trying to find positive meaning in that are clear in the story. It instead just dogmatically focuses on the fact that they are rebelling against something. The author says that no one can transcend the human condition merely by being angry or impatient with it, which again I think is maybe a fair critique to some degree, but anyone who reads the story should be able to tell that these people are not merely being angry and impatient with the human condition. They are trying to fix the human condition or find a new solution for problems with their cultural condition that aren't necessarily even related to the human condition. So I think there's a little bit of misdirection going on in this article to apply some sort of, square critique that can be applied to lots of different people without delving into what they think. And then towards the end of the article, he attacks the hipsters' use of jive talk, basically saying that they're acting like children on a playground, trying to distinguish themselves from other people by using terminology that no one can understand and that adds no meaning to their language, which may be true to some degree of jive talk, but there are lots of expressions in these hipster dialects or whatever that capture meaning that isn't captured by regular expressions, just like an idiom or anything else. So I think there's a lot that's meaningful that's just not analyzed, and the author doesn't point to any specific usages of jive talk to explain that it's, distinction without difference, or difference without distinction. And he says that the beat movement equates progress with motion, which this I think may be a fair critique, although incomplete, because I do see that in On the Road especially, the beats are happy to move around and be ungrounded, and whenever a situation gets bad, leave and go to a better situation, and they consider this like some sort of renewal, even though they're not actually progressing, they're not actually fixing anything, they're just moving around. And then finally, the author claims that the beats are not saints as Ginsberg portrays them because they have no goals for redemption, ending with, quote, Mr. Kerouac has nothing to say and he says it badly, end quote. And I think it may be true to some degree that the beats do not have very good redemption goals, but I think they do have something in mind. I think they're trying to find some sort of alternative mode of redemption, but they don't have it in hand yet. Moving on to the other older source, Freeman, from 59, so 1 year after that first source. And Freeman's article is called Beat Up or Beatific, published in the Antioch Review. And Freeman would fall on the side that the beats are more beat up than beatific, beatific being a term that Kerouac coined. This is a critique of their lifestyle. He's saying that their supreme value is essentially mania, and he's saying that women are treated worse by the beats than they are by suburban culture, and that the lifestyle being propagated by the beat movement is extremely inherently misogynistic, which again, I think this is a little bit of a flat and negative critique, but I think it's hitting on something true, which is if the beats are trying to establish a more fair or a more careful society, they're not hitting the mark. And this, I thought it was interesting. It's sort of, it's more talking from a standard view of what society should be like, but it is bringing in a little bit of a feminist critique, which is kind of early for 1959, especially compared to the other sources dealing with Kerouac from around that time. Now to Sealv from 63. So Sealv is a little bit closer to the social revolution, cultural revolution in America. So I think by 1963, there was an understanding that the beat movement was legitimate and a real movement and not just, a couple of characters with no uniting theme. I think by now, people were starting to understand what was going on, so they take it more seriously. Sealv seems to take it more seriously than the authors writing in the 50s. And Sealv is focusing on the archetype of the tramp that is developed by Kerouac. He says that Kerouac follows Crane in making the American bum, quote, the ghost of the frontiersman, end quote. And he talks about a line from Whitman through London to Kerouac that develops this idea of the American tramp, whereas Whitman did not have this archetype to work with, Jack London sort of developed it in his stories about movement across the country and frontier lifestyle on the West Coast, and that Kerouac really, really develops it. I thought a good quote from this article was he calls Kerouac, quote, a bohemian aristocrat, a Byron in blue jeans, end quote, which was meant to be an insult, I think, in the article, but Kerouac would probably be proud to be called a bohemian aristocrat, a Byron in blue jeans. It's very poetic. And in this article, he draws the connection between Dean Moriarty in On the Road and Huck Finn from Mark Twain, especially talking about their resentment for society and their absent drunken fathers who have an even greater resentment for society. And he ends by admitting that the archetype of the tramp does intrigue the American mind, saying that we need the tramp more as a mirror than as a role model. So he's not all in with the beat movement, but he is viewing the tramp as something that's good to talk about. So I don't know if he's on the same page with Kerouac about glorification of the tramp, but he talks about the archetype of the trickster in African American literature and American literature, and relates the tramp to that it's a part of society that we can't ignore, and it's good to theorize about. And then we get Prothero in 1991 with his article On the Holy Road, the Beat Movement as Spiritual Protest, published in the Harvard Theological Review. So now we're getting some serious literature on the subject. And he takes it from a much more positive stance, talking about Kerouac as legitimate, talking about the movement as good, and pointing to specific themes, not just glossing over things. And this article is all about redefining the beat movement as having a positive goal of spiritual protest, rather than as just being some sort of generic revolt, which he says in this article that scholarship until this point had fallen in a rut by talking about the movement as a simple revolt and not even trying to talk about what the meaning of the movement was, because they're assuming there was no meaning. And this article gives a good history of the people at the center of the movement, emphasizes Spangler's influence on Ginsberg and Kerouac, and points to the continuities between the beat movement in the 50s and the religious pluralism of the 60s. So certainly by the 90s, we're looking back at those first three sources, especially Sylvan 1963, and really starting to get a better picture of how Kerouac fits into all of this. And this article is insisting that the Black and Latin liberation theologies in America, as well as a popular interest in Zen Buddhism and other Eastern religious currents, that all started with the beat movement. Whereas we tend to think of it happening in the late 60s, early 70s with the Cultural Revolution in Vietnam and all that. It actually was well-grounded in American culture all across the country before that, and just really bloomed with the Cultural Revolution. And the main point of this article is that the Beats were doing the work of reforming the profane, not just leaning into nihilism and anarchy. So wherever Kerouac talks about these nasty, sinful acts, there is a surface level recognition that these things are nasty and sinful, but he doesn't stop there. He's trying to reform the profane. He's not simply glorifying it. He's trying to find something good in it. And then Johnston from 2005. His article, Consumption, Addiction, Vision, Energy, Political Economies and Utopian Visions in the Writings of the Beat Generation. So already here we can see he's listing all of these different themes. So now we're really starting to trace themes through Kerouac. And this article is from 2005. The author focuses on other authors that came before Kerouac, directly before Rexroth and Burroughs, to explain Kerouac and Ginsberg's economic philosophy. So there's a lot of talk about Marxism and other currents, Hegelianism, and all of these books in Burroughs' library that Kerouac and Ginsberg were allowed to borrow and that really shaped their writing. and then their adventures with Rexroth on the West Coast, and Kerouac and Rexroth's sort of antagonistic relationship with each other, through which they developed or especially Kerouac developed a greater understanding of Zen Buddhism while he was in San Francisco. So there's a bit of a historical aspect in this article too. We're not just talking about on the road, but we're talking about Kerouac's life. So there's a bit of, maybe not mythos, but kind of the way people view Ernest Hemingway. There's a little bit more of that, like that this is a legitimate character with a life story, with certain cities that he's associated with, certain people that he's associated with. Like there's much more of a frame to view Kerouac through by 2005. And one good point from this article was that Kerouac focuses on descriptions of objects to emphasize natural beauty and necessity while de-emphasizing the exchange value. So basically saying that they do have an economic lien, but they're trying to focus more on the beauty or the necessity of a product. So they're maybe frustrated or upset with the mindless consumption, but they're not throwing off consumerism. But that there's a change in that by the end of the novel when Dean and Sal visit the Mexican whorehouse and just blow money because they're misunderstanding the exchange rate. So now we're looking at specific themes in On the Road and pointing to subtle differences that are made throughout the novel. So I guess I'll move on to the next section, talking mostly about geography and movement and mobility. And this is kind of interesting. I didn't expect to see one of these like side conversations from a different discipline, but there were apparently a couple of geographers who were writing about On the Road, talking about the geography, the different cities that are listed, movements from one part of the nation to another nation and what it symbolizes and those sorts of things. So Cresswell is one who talks about that in his article, Mobility as Resistance, a Geographical Reading of Kerouac's On the Road from 1993. So again, a newer one. And in this article, he departs from other geographers who tend to view culture as a superorganism. He departs because he sees that as flattening the internal dynamics of a culture. And he says that Kerouac is dealing specifically with the internal dynamics, basically a counterculture fighting the regular culture and all of the subtleties and borrowing and themes that flow. Whereas other geographers are viewing culture as the whole thing, and so they're not really getting a good picture of what Kerouac is trying to say with his geographical movement. They're just considering Kerouac as, an American dealing with geography. So this article frames the concept of mobility as an important American idea, but with multiple implications, and it identifies that mobility for Kerouac is a tool of resistance against the hegemonic culture. And then it talks about movement and jazz, which we'll get into in the next section. And there was another article by McDowell that Cresswell and McDowell, I think, were responding to each other in an exchange in the same publication. Although I didn't cite the McDowell one because it's a feminist op-ed, so it's just a not really a academic style of writing. But there was some back and forth between McDowell and Cresswell. And then Rycroft in 1996 comes down to sort out their disagreement. So I'll scroll to him. So in Rycroft's article, Changing Lanes, Textuality Often on the Road, published in Transactions of the Institute of British Geographers. So this is not even a literature review. This is a geography review, but dealing with On the Road and a dispute that two other critics are having about On the Road. All of these are geographers. But Rycroft says that the other two, Cresswell and McDowell, are in a narrow argument about the meaning of geographical references in On the Road, and he critiques them for reading Kerouac anachronistically and making the scope too narrow, having a predetermined frame. So basically, this guy is just bringing some classic literature theory to the geographers to sort of sort them out and put them back on track. But the main argument that this article is making is that Kerouac meant something different than what these other geographers were interpreting him to mean. So I know that sounds all bogged down, because it kind of is. These were all short articles and very narrow, but they were all dealing with each other, so I thought it was an interesting exchange. But if anything, I think it proves that by the 90s, the literature dealing with Kerouac and On the Road is cross-discipline. So it's not just snobby English professors sitting up in their offices writing mean critiques about Kerouac. Now we're actually searching for it for meaning that can affect other disciplines. So on to the jazz and black critique. The two main authors talking about this were Marx and Malcolm. Marx is from 1916, Malcolm's from 1999. Marx's article is called The White Negro and the Negro White. Let me scroll to it. So this article again talks about social mobility, sexual license, bougie values, and it talks about these two different groups, the white Negro and the Negro white, basically talking about how there are upwardly mobile black people and there are downwardly mobile white people, and the beats would be the downwardly mobile white people who are viewing themselves as the same part of society, if not the same category as the blacks. They find greater identification with them and sort of glorify them. And the author points to a few passages in On the Road where that happens. Like Sal gives glorified descriptions of black people that he meets on the street and talks about how he wishes he was happy as them and that sort of thing. Wishes he had access to the parts of society that they have access to. And the author says that the Beats have taken their hipness from the example of black culture, although it manifested more as a revolt against white society than as a union with black society. And then he talks about how upwardly mobile blacks are actually very conservative, which is not true of the Beat movement. And so they're not the same in that way. And then he talks about how both categories are viewed by the hegemonic white society, and talks about how they're hated for different reasons. The upwardly mobile blacks are threatening because they're doing it better than the whites, basically. And the downwardly mobile whites are threatening because they're finding an alternative, or they're enjoying the things that the hegemonic white society has cut itself off from and wishes it could enjoy but refuses to. But ultimately, the author says the Beats do not know what it means to be black, and the blacks do not know what it means to be middle class. And that was in the 60s, so it's not a very delicate dealing with race, but I thought it was straightforward, and probably very fair for the moment. And then Malcolm, in 1999, has an article titled Jazz America, Jazz and African American Culture in Kerouac's On the Road, published in Contemporary Literature. And in this article, this reminded me a lot of Langston Hughes' attempts to legitimize black literature and to incorporate elements from jazz in literature to sort of, stylize a movement, or basically pull themes out of thin air and create a movement. So this author is analyzing what Kerouac is doing, trying to incorporate jazz techniques into his literary style. So he talks about different parallels between Kerouac's writing and the playing of the saxophone, like blowing, the jazz chorus, repetition of progressions, and other concepts like that. And then he compares On the Road to Don Quixote, talking about different improvised melodies over the same chord structure, as the chord structure being the quest myth. And he critiques Kerouac for focusing on individual jazz performers instead of the cities and scenes that they came from. And he criticizes Kerouac for notably ignoring Ellington in his discussion of specific jazz artists and a history of jazz that Kerouac gives in On the Road. And then he links Kerouac to the Romantics through his appreciation of emotional spontaneity. So there's a commonality between the Romantic writers and the jazz performers and Kerouac in that they see spontaneity as the seed of truth. And then he critiques Kerouac for appreciating the genre of jazz without acknowledging the painful history of slavery, which, again, I wouldn't expect to see that sort of critique from a source before the 80s. And yeah, certainly you don't see it in Marx. And this article also links specific plot actions to different jazz concerts that are mentioned throughout the story, basically giving a lot of meaning to the specific jazz performer and venue and city, and trying to draw some sort of meaning out of that relates to the plot. Like, for instance, Sal settles down with Laura, and Ellington switches from swing music to bop music and plays at a highbrow show at a prestigious theater. So it's sort of like a restoration to middle class or something like that, like a semi-acceptance of norms, or maybe a becoming the norm. And it takes a few examples from On the Road to show that Kerouac is using jazz concerts and different performances to carry the plot, or to parallel the plot. But ultimately, the author says that the influence of jazz is clear on the Road, but is insufficient as a guiding principle, and that Kerouac's primary work here has been to expand the acceptable subject matter to include junkies and jazzy hipsters. So, similar to a lot of the stuff I've read about Langston Hughes, the idea is like, good effort, but it's not really possible to do jazz literature justice. That's the theme that I get. And then I've got one more article that kind of sits in a category of its own, by Gare, titled Thalata Thalata, Xenophon, Joyce, and Kerouac. And this is from the Ohio State University Press in 2018, so a very recent article. And this one is interesting because it takes lots into consideration. Like, now that all of the basic stuff has been reviewed and everyone's talked about the themes and said what's true and what isn't, now we're getting into like tiny little references that go hundreds of years back and have all sorts of implications for how to read the novel, which I didn't see any other sources that did that specific of a dealing with On the Road. So this is kind of cool. But it's basically saying that reference, Thalata Thalata, is a Greek phrase that's taken from Xenophon, a long epic that he wrote, that Joyce references. So Joyce uses Thalata Thalata in his Ulysses. And the author is basically saying that, so Kerouac uses this quote too, and he's saying that Kerouac did not likely get it from Xenophon, even though he grew up in Greek culture and would have been immersed in Greek references, that he likely pulled it from Joyce's Ulysses. And he goes through a historical analysis and shows when Kerouac became aware of Joyce and when Joyce became aware of Xenophon and all of that. And then he really delves into the meaning of the reference as used in Joyce and as used in Kerouac, and says that even though Kerouac's not referencing Xenophon, or is likely not referencing Xenophon, that it's a strong trace that holds true. Like the way Xenophon used it carries through Joyce to Kerouac, which is really interesting, that you could accurately reference something without being aware of it. And he talks about anabasis and ketabasis, which are the Greek terms for a travel basically from coast to coast, from the sea inland and then from inland to the sea, which is what Xenophon's novel is about. And I think the novel is titled Anabasis, the epic, not the novel. And he talks about how On the Road is similar in structure, that it's a travel from the East Coast to the center of the country in Denver, and then from Denver to the West Coast, and then all the way back. And he points to a couple of parallels between Xenophon's epic and Kerouac's On the Road to illustrate that there is some sort of structural parallel there, even though On the Road is not an epic. He's drawing a long, thin line from Greek epics to the American travel story, and tying it to this one specific literature reference. So just a cool article. Didn't have any complaints with it. I thought everything that it said was very fair and very well researched. So, sorry, that was a bit of a long presentation. I didn't think it was going to go 30 minutes. But yeah, my main impression is that the older sources were not very fair to Kerouac and did not do a good job of situating him historically. But once he did get a good historical situation, and more recent researchers had a good literature review of him, then people really started exploding and delving into the meaning in the novel and considering the movement as legitimate and trying to find out what it meant rather than just dismissing it as being meaningless. And I really didn't find any articles that talked about On the Road from a different angle. Most of the angles were talking about how it relates to black culture and jazz music, how it relates to themes of mobility, and then this question about social hegemony and spiritual revolution. So those are the main frames. Yep.